This is the Court Leader's Advantage, a podcast series for court professionals and by court professionals. Brought to you by thecourtleader.net and in cooperation with NACM, the National Association for Court Management. In this episode on mental health in the courts, we bring the discussion home. In previous episodes, we talked about the extent of the problem nationally and how it affects each community. We discussed the need for community collaboration. We explored the challenge of criminal competency to stand trial. And we learned how mental health manifests itself in trauma in our young people. Today, we're asking, what should our courts be doing now? I'm Pete Kiefer, and welcome to the Court Leader's Advantage podcast series. This month is the last of our 5-episode discussion with members of the National Judicial Task Force to examine state courts' response to mental illness. Some of the topics we'll explore include: what should judges and court administrators be doing right now to address this crisis? How do we educate the public about the realities of mental health? What kind of role will court staff play in this new model for courts? And what advice do these panelists have for the rest of us? I'm joined today by the Honorable Christopher Goff, Justice of the Indiana Supreme Court; Scott Block, Statewide Behavioral Health Administrator for the Illinois Administrative Office of the Courts; Walter Thompson, Peer Recovery Support Specialist and retired non-commissioned officer in the United States Army; and Patty Tobias, Principal Court Management Consultant for the National Center for State Courts. Thank you all for joining today's podcast. Justice Goff, I watched the recent session at the NACM Annual Conference on the work of the National Mental Health Task Force. Now, to understand the theme of that presentation, what is the one thing you think courts ought to be doing right now to address the mental health crisis in the justice system?
The answer to my question, bottom line, is convene your stakeholders. But probably the more important part of my answer to your question is prepare for that meeting. And what I am really excited about is what the task force has put together to equip judges when they're trying to prepare for that meeting with their stakeholders. When they're trying to prepare for that initial meeting with their stakeholders, it's important for judges to realize that they're not alone in trying to offer an alternative response to law enforcement in their communities. And the task force has put together a package of resources. One in particular that trial judges will find helpful is called the Leading Change Guide. And the Leading Change Guide is just chock full of helpful suggestions on what court professionals, judges in particular, need to do when they understand this phenomenon, when they understand that nationally, we made a conscious decision to deinstitutionalize folks living with serious mental illness and put them back in their communities. And when you take a population out of an institutional environment where everything is unified, services, budgets, and you put them in a community setting where people really need to get out of their silos and work collaboratively to find common solutions, it's important to be strategic about that. And I love the Leading Change Guide because it gives judicial officers some of the best tools available to not only have that conversation and educate folks up and get their buy-in, but to really equip their communities for success. The resources of the task force are available online at ncsc.org/behavioral health. And so again, I would start by convening my stakeholders, but before I convene them, I would spend an afternoon, a day, maybe 2 days, really educating myself on what tools are out there to have a successful first meeting and really move the ball forward in this area.
Scott Block?
I'd just like to add a couple comments to reinforce Justice Goff's commentary, and I would wholeheartedly agree that one of the first things that we could do in the judicial branch is embrace and exercise our power of convening those multidisciplinary and cross-sector stakeholders. But the other piece of that I'd like to mention is that I, in the state behavioral health administrator role, often provide counsel to trial court administrators who feel overwhelmed with the breadth of the mental health issues related to individuals within their courts. And I do want to assure today's audience, as I do those trial court administrators, that no one expects wholesale reform or overnight change. What we really need to do is determine our starting points, and a starting point that makes sense for our state or trial courts. And this can look very different across different communities. So taking that first step is often the hardest, but we definitely need to engage all the players and justice partners that could help us achieve these goals.
Walter Thompson?
Well, I think as me, as far as my role is, it gives that background as far as what they do when they get there and how to get there inside the communities there. So as I go out, as I talk to people before they come into court, before everything goes on, we just try to let them know what they can do, how they can do it, and what resources they have for themselves to make sure this happens. Because to what Judge Goff was saying is, how you want to change things, how you want to go about it. And that's what the peer specialist does. Once you get there, and then once you start acting on the clients, then now you're able to help them more.
Patty Tobias?
Well, so I agree with everything that Justice Goff and Scott and Walter have talked about. The first step is just awareness, awareness that there are some real serious challenges, and it doesn't matter what kind of docket you have or what your role in the courts is. You might be the clerk of the court working in the area of child welfare or family law. It doesn't matter what your position is. But if you have some general awareness of the impact that our courts are having on those that are appearing before us, those with serious mental illness or trauma, I think that's the first step. And then, as Justice Goff mentioned, it's getting a little smarter, spending a little time with the resources that are available. There's a lot of information and resources that the task force has prepared. So, again, if you want to get started in the criminal area, or if you want to get started in the civil area, no matter what your position is, take a look at some of those resources and start asking questions of others that you see. And then again, supporting that role of the role of convening and working with stakeholders across systems. But the big message that we always like to convey is just get started. There's a lot of work ahead of us, and you don't have to have a 10-year plan. It may take us 10 years in each of our jurisdictions, but the important area is to just get started and have an awareness and get smarter about the challenges, but more importantly, the solutions that are out there.
Walter? Health experts have said that individuals with mental health issues are more likely to be victims than perpetrators. Yet when the public thinks about crime and the mentally ill, I dare say they think about John Hinckley. They think about Mark David Chapman. They think about Simon Marshall, who just pushed Michelle Go to her death in a New York City subway platform. How do we change the public's perception of criminal justice and the mentally ill?
Well, I think it's about education. It's about learning how people act and how people are. Dealing with mental illness, a peer specialist, we have to go through, as far as when we get someone there, and understand that their education on what they need to do and how they need to do it. And I'm not talking about just educating the clients. I'm talking about educating your community. Because what I'm doing now is I'm going out right now, letting the community know that we're dealing, what type of mental illness we're dealing with, what kind of community you have. Let's say you got a person that's keep getting arrested, that you thinking is this just a criminal. No, let them understand that this person suffers from a mental illness and what we got to do with it. So the education of your community, the education of your people, that's one thing that you need to do. And now people will no longer say, well, he just has this problem. He's just a criminal. But no, the person really suffers from mental illness. Now you got to go through to getting them the treatment they need. You got to go to get the medication and just the overall education of your community. When your community understands what mental illness is, now they're able to help people more. So it just won't just go to the courts. You'll be able to catch that before it actually get to the courts once you educate your community.
Scott, on the May podcast episode, Judges Kathleen Quigley and Teresa Delick proposed that all court staff receive trauma awareness training. Now, this implied that staff should be given a more extensive role in this whole effort. What kind of role do you see court staff playing in this expanded mental health model?
I believe we need to look at trauma in the larger context of behavioral health as a whole. The marginalization, stigmatization of mental illness and substance use disorders is significant within our courts, and often these issues do stem from an untreated or underlying trauma. Building a court culture that recognizes signs and symptoms of mental illness, substance use, and even trauma, and then understanding the effects on individuals and families is key to developing appropriate and effective responses. In a so-called expanded mental health model, I'm a big proponent of training all court staff in recognizing signs and symptoms. And there are many curriculums out there for laypersons and non-behavioral health professionals, curriculums such as mental health first aid or de-escalation type of trainings. But the key is all court staff receiving trainings, including our clerks, our bailiffs, our court reporters, and looking at how our institution views and responds to these issues and in developing responses in a way that provide the best possible outcome for the public service we perform. And then on the flip side of this, as court professionals, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we too are very susceptible to vicarious trauma, compassion, fatigue, whatever you'd like to call it. But repeated exposure to often troubling and or even abnormal types of events really requires that we turn the lens inward and look for ways to ensure the mental health and wellness of those that are also tasked with the administration of justice.
And on top of that, I mean, Scott's exactly right. We also, this is training that is required and necessary for all of our judges across the nation. The task force is beginning a pilot project actually this weekend, working with the Judges and Psychiatrists Leadership Initiative to train the trainers. We want to train judge and psychiatrist teams that will be available in every state. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It will take some time, but we hope to have a judge and psychiatrist team available and equipped to teach our judges about mental illness, about substance use disorders, about trauma, about race and equity, and how to better respond in the courtroom and in the community. So we're really excited and now are at a point where we're beginning to think about implementation of the task force recommendations, which will include training opportunities for both court professionals, court staff, no matter what position, as well as our state trial judges across the nation.
Justice Goff, it sounds like the behavioral health diversion model that the task force envisions is going to be very expensive. For example, many, if not most jurisdictions, don't have nearly the available resources to address such an increase in needed mental health services. How does a court go about convincing funding bodies to fund such an expanded model?
A couple of thoughts. You know, it doesn't cost anything to organize, and so that's the first point. And I think it's worth emphasizing because this collaborative approach, getting your stakeholders together and asking, you know, how do we do things now? What do we need to do differently? And what resources do we need to get there? Is really kind of the conversation that you need to have. SAMHSA, when they roll out kind of the deliverables around the National 988 Suicide Prevention Hotline, they tell states to think about equipping all of your communities with 1, someone to call, 2, someone to respond, and 3, somewhere to go. And so that's really the conversation that community stakeholders need to have. Oftentimes, they're not going to have an alternative in place. And so they need to plan, they need to reach out to their state Supreme Courts, somebody like Scott or somebody in a position of court services who helps navigate relationships with local trial courts and find out what resources are available to plug in and fill in those gaps. So point one is, organize. That doesn't cost anything, and at least have a working understanding of where your gaps are. Two is really this. This problem is one that when you start having a conversation about it, you'll find out that everyone is talking about. And there's a lot of money, a lot of resources that are out there. The task force has spent significant time cultivating relationships with stakeholder groups. Chief among them probably is the National Association of Counties. They're very aware of this problem, and they're very interested in it, because when people living with mental illness have no place to go but the county jail, that costs a lot of money. And county commissioners, county council persons, they're not fans of that process. There's a lot of money, a lot of federal money that has been rolled out to municipalities, to cities. And unless you are organized in a way that allows you to have conversations with these very important stakeholders, you as a court, as the chief convener, is oftentimes, almost all the time, the chief referral source for these mental health services, are going to be missing out on resources that are intended to address this problem in your community. So that's point two. You really need to organize and have meaningful conversations with your stakeholders, chief among them, the folks that are making these financial decisions. And that's so important because, right, oftentimes these folks are part-time. They're not going to understand what you do unless you establish a relationship with them and you actually explain to them how important it is and how meaningful their work can be to solving the problem. The third piece is this. The federal enabling legislation that created 988 requires states to implement a version of 988, in every state. But it also comes with it an ability to assess a surcharge for use of the service, and that surcharge can be used to build up the infrastructure necessary to make the system work. And a really small number of states have taken advantage of that surcharge. And I think it's important for stakeholders, right? A unified justice system to speak as one and really take the time to explain to the members of their state legislature, to their governor, why it's important, why it's worthwhile to properly fund 988 so that there actually is the ability to sustain this alternative pathway for folks who enter into the criminal justice system or at risk of entering into the criminal justice system, or perhaps the child welfare system, really because a community has no other alternative fielded. So those are just a few points that I would make. Doesn't cost anything to plan, critically important to convene and have collaborative discussions, and make sure that you're taking advantage of this federal legislation and building an infrastructure that's sustainable.
I just wanted to add one thing to everything that Justice Goff said, and that is what we're seeing is some significant federal funding coming through what are called certified community behavioral health clinics. And the federal government is funding these certified community behavioral health clinics, and there are requirements to reach out both ways, for the courts to reach out to the clinics and for the clinics to reach out and see how they can best assist and provide assessment and treatment services to individuals in that community. So I'd really encourage every court administrator, everyone listening, to determine, do they have a certified community behavioral health clinic already in their community? And if they don't, reach out and find out what you can do to obtain a certified community behavioral health clinic in your community. So that's another opportunity for funding that, again, I think the plan over the next few years is that all communities will have access to that funding stream.
Peter, I'm also the vice mayor of Florida City, Florida. And I'm looking at that also, that clinic, the certified community behavioral health clinic, because I know what that can do as far as getting people to court and handling their mental illness. And you can be doing it right at a community level. And now that right there starts is the education part of what's going on, because now you're inside your community and you got a behavior center. As I ride around, I see a lot of medical centers, but I don't see the behavior. And I know what's in the courts because I'm in court at least 3 to 5 days a week concerning mental illness, and 5 days a week outside in the communities. So I know this is what they need as far as that, because I know they have funding for it. So it's about, the funding is expensive, but it's worth everything it is, because you're now actually helping your community, you're helping the courts, you're helping your county, you're helping every little facet around you, even the families, because it's not just going to affect the client that goes to court, but it's going to help his family. So it's going to create that ripple effect. We all talk about that ripple effect, but it comes as a negative. But now the ripple effect by having these clinics and now having the money to do everything is going to be a positive effect to everything that's going on. So what Patty said about these certified community behavioral health clinics is, I think it's one of the things that's on the mark. And I know I'm trying to help my city out with that right now.
Walter, the sequential intercept model, particularly at intercept 0, appears to rely heavily on private citizens taking that first step connecting individuals with mental health services. Taking that first step on a friend or a loved one can really be traumatic. How do we train the general public to take on this significant new responsibility?
You got to get out there. And this is what the peers are. We're not an office sitting around people. We're community. We're community based. And I'm glad I have a couple of hats, like I said earlier, as the vice mayor. Now I can go around and I can be in my city and I can start talking to people and I can start seeing. When you start telling people, okay, I work at the mental health court, and when they hear mental, that's when they start speaking. Well, I got a brother, I got a son, I got a daughter, I got a sister that's going through that. So as what we start doing is we start developing this as the peers. We're able not to just sit in the court and wait for our participants to come there. We go out and we start educating them on the programs that they can go through and they can see. And when we start passing that around, you get less people to talk about, because people start going to the programs more. We actually go to the independent living services and we talk to them, the people that's there. We go from there. We go to the centers where they actually doing their PSR, psychosocial recovery classes, and we participate then. And so when they start seeing this, they start saying, wait a minute, I can too be the same way that you are. Especially when we start telling people what we are going through. Now is when I'm talking to the participants here, and I tell them that I have been suffering from PTSD, severe PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and they see how I function around. They want to be a part of it, but it's a part of their recovery. So, that's when we come say, okay, you got it, I got it. We're going to recover together. And we start using all the tools that we're using, that we're in court with. Because when we're in court, I got to take you to a wellness recovery action plan. I got to take you to an interactive journaling. These are classes that they have. But when you give it to someone who is not inside the courtroom, that's less people going to court, because they start taking the action there and they start saying this, wait a minute, I can be as normal as him. And like, well, who's really normal? You're normal, you're you, and I am me. And so we go through it and it's less people. And trust me, I get these phone calls. We get them by 6-7 days a week, because this is what we want to do. And we know that's what the community base is. And that's what it should be. Not waiting for it, but going out and giving it.
Peter, if I may, just build upon Walter's comments. And Walter, I love your passion, and I love how you really promote and advocate for access to care. And just would like to reinforce that this universal prevalence of mental illness within our society is something that we can collectively rally around, in that, statistics show 1 in 5 individuals struggle with a mental health disorder at any given time. And, we're all families, friends, neighbors, loved ones, so on and so forth. So we all know someone that is either currently struggling with or has potentially struggled with mental illness in the past. And to loudly promote the mantra that our behavioral health advocates have really rallied around in the past years is that there is no health without mental health. And what this really means is that we need to develop and foster environments and societies that promote and encourage access to mental health in the same way that we do physical health care, and really continue to embrace that there really is no difference between those two.
Finally, what advice do you have for those tuning in to today's episode? Justice Goff?
Peter, I think the most important advice I have is take responsibility and ownership for the quality of life in your community. If you are a court professional, you are someone charged with the responsibility to offer folks a real option to resolve conflict peacefully. I'm an old problem-solving court judge. I was a trial judge in rural Indiana at the height of the opioid epidemic, and it was necessary to step up and convene stakeholders to find out what we could do to keep people from dying. And that's really the same kind of challenge that we're confronted with here. We've got a significant population of folks who are being exposed to the criminal justice system, and they shouldn't be. And whether you agree with me when I say that or not, you recognize that it's expensive and our criminal justice resources are finite. And so I think it's just incumbent upon us as folks who live in communities to take responsibility, to take ownership for the quality of life, for the legitimacy of what we do as problem solvers, as decision makers, and try and work towards a common solution. Resources are out there. The task force is here to guide and assist you as you take on these challenges. But get started. It'll make all the difference.
Scott?
I will just succinctly say a very similar commentary to Justice Goff, in that take that first step, work at a pace that's comfortable for you, and don't go at it alone. These are community solutions to community problems, and we must address this with our institutional and justice partners.
Walter?
This is why I'm on this task force. This is why it is, because I enjoy that I got the professionals on it, the justices, the chief justices, the psychiatrists, that my community can see these people, that they can see that there are people that care about them enough to create a task force, to take care, to help them out with their mental illness, to put them now on the front line of now that you see that someone do help you, that help you, they care for you, and they don't have to just sit there and say, well, he's just a judge and he's just gonna slam the gavel and just gonna put you away. That no, we're gonna work on it. And when you see this type of task force is, and I tell people all the time, when you see something from the NSCS, read it, look at it, because it's here to help you. And now I'm seeing this, it's no longer this huge task force, them just sitting there. They're now inside my little community now. They're in there. These judges are there, even if they have never been there. But they are there because I am showing them that we have people that loves you and want to help you and want you to understand what mental illness that you have, and you can be normal. And so this is one of the greatest things I see right here. And that's why I have so much passion for this.
Patty?
As a longtime state and trial court administrator, I think it's really exciting to be thinking about person-centered justice. When I think of person-centered justice, I think about every person that's appearing in our courts. And I think of them as our family. How would I want my brother, my sister, my neighbor, my friend, my family, my son, my daughter to be treated in my justice system? And when I think of person-centered justice, it is a wonderful way to think about and pull all of this together, to pull together all of the resources of the task force to really be thinking how to go forward. So again, think about person-centered justice, and that person before you or talking with you is again a family member, a neighbor, and how would you want them treated? And so that would be my last piece of thought to leave you with.
I want to thank Justice Chris Goff, Scott Block, Walter Thompson, and Patty Tobias for joining us today and sharing their thoughts on what courts should be doing right now to address the crisis in mental health. We all need to join this effort, and we need to join today. As always, my thanks to you court professionals tuning into today's episode. You see the mental health crisis in your court every day. It's your professional work that will move the courts forward to addressing this pressing issue. Thank you. Join us on Tuesday, September 20th, for another episode dealing with the issues facing our courts. This has been the Court Leaders Advantage podcast series. I'm Pete Kiefer, and thanks for joining us today. Thanks for joining us today. The Court Leaders Advantage is a regular podcast on courts and court administration. Today's episode will be available on our website, on YouTube, on Facebook, on iTunes, on LinkedIn, and on Twitter. Become part of the conversation. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, email us. Our address is CLApodcast, that's all one word, @nacomnet.org. Did you hear an interesting comment by one of the panelists that you would like to listen to again, but you don't want to search through the entire episode to find it? The additional resources section of the webpage contains a question time marker sheet. Just find the discussion question on the sheet, and next to it is the time that question was asked. You can then quickly fast forward to that time in the episode and listen to the panelists' comments. Remember, if you don't have time to watch an episode, you can always listen to the audio version. Listen in your car or on the bus on your way to or from work. You never have to miss an episode. I'm Pete Kiefer, and on behalf of our guests, the Court Leader website, and the National Association for Court Management, thank you, and have a great day. The views, information, and opinions expressed during this episode are solely those of the host and the individual presenters. They do not necessarily represent the position of the National Association for Court Management.